A single movie destroyed an entire Hollywood studio. Just one film. In the mid-1990s, Carolco Pictures was one of the most powerful independent studios in Hollywood. The company had built its reputation producing enormous action hits that dominated theaters around the world. Their films were loud, expensive, ambitious, and incredibly profitable. This was the studio behind Terminator 2, Judgment Day, a science fiction spectacle that redefined blockbuster filmmaking. They had also delivered massive successes like Total Recall, Basic Instinct, and Cliffhanger. For a time, Carolco seemed unstoppable, but behind the scenes, the studio's success was hiding something dangerous. Then Carolco decided to make a pirate movie. Pirate films had once been one of Hollywood's most beloved genres. Studios believed pirate movies were simply too expensive and too risky. Ships had to be built. Water scenes were difficult to shoot. Weather created constant delays. Special effects were complicated. Most studios avoided them entirely. Carolco saw an opportunity. The project was called Cutthroat Island. It would follow a daring female pirate captain, Morgan Adams, racing against rival treasure hunters to recover a legendary hidden fortune. The story promised naval battles, exotic islands, explosive action sequences, and sweeping adventure. For Carolco executives, it sounded like the perfect blockbuster, but the production hadn't even begun before the first warning signs appeared. Originally, the film was intended to star Michael Douglas, one of the biggest actors in Hollywood at the time. Douglas was expected to play the villain, a ruthless pirate captain hunting the same treasure as the film's hero. His presence gave the project enormous credibility, but as production approached, Douglas suddenly withdrew from the film. The reasons were complicated. Some reports suggested scheduling conflicts. Others claimed he had become uncomfortable with the script and the escalating budget. Whatever the reason, the project lost its biggest star before cameras even started rolling. The production scrambled to find a replacement. Eventually, the role went to Frank Langella, a respected actor, but not the kind of box office draw that could guarantee massive ticket sales. Meanwhile, the film's lead role went to Geena Davis, who had recently won an Academy Award and gained popularity from films like Thelma and Louise. Davis committed fully to the role, training extensively in sword fighting, horseback riding, and stunt work. But even she understood the scale of the challenge ahead. This was not a typical adventure movie. The film was becoming one of the most expensive productions Hollywood had ever attempted. Director Renny Harlin had built a reputation for high-energy action films like Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger. He loved spectacle. He loved explosions. And for Cutthroat Island, he wanted to create something enormous. The production constructed full-scale pirate ships, some of the largest practical sets ever built for an adventure film. Massive harbor environments were recreated in Malta. Hundreds of crew members worked to stage elaborate naval battles filled with cannon fire, collapsing masts, and chaotic sword fights across wooden decks. Everything was designed to feel real. And realism came at a price. Ships had to be repaired constantly after explosive scenes. Weather delays slowed filming. Water sequences proved incredibly difficult to control. Every day of shooting cost enormous amounts of money. The budget began climbing rapidly. Originally estimated around $60 million, the cost quickly rose higher and higher and higher. By the time filming was halfway complete, the project was already approaching $90 million. For a pirate movie in the 1990s, that number was staggering. But the financial danger wasn't just the production itself. Carolco's entire company structure was becoming unstable. Unlike major Hollywood studios, backed by giant corporations, Carolco operated as an independent company. That meant it relied heavily on complex financing deals to fund its movies. Once the studio borrowed money, sold distribution rights in advance, partnered with international investors. These arrangements allowed Carolco to produce enormous films without the financial backing of a traditional studio. But the system worked only if the movies succeeded. Each project carried enormous risk. By the mid-1990s, Carolco had accumulated hundreds of millions of dollars in financial obligations. Some projects had already underperformed at the box office. Others had required expensive reshoots. Investors were growing nervous. And now the studio had nearly all of its hopes riding on one film, Cutthroat Island. If the movie became a blockbuster, Carolco could stabilize its finances and continue producing large-scale action films. If it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. As production continued, the scale of Cutthroat Island kept expanding. Rennie Harlan pushed for bigger action sequences, more explosions, more ships, more spectacle. The film's final battle alone required enormous sets, dozens of stunt performers, and complicated practical effects involving collapsing structures and fire across the harbor. For audiences, these scenes would look thrilling. For Carolco's accountants, they looked terrifying. Every additional stunt increased the budget. Every extra shooting day added more cost. By the end of production, the film's budget had ballooned to approximately $98 million. In 1995, that number placed the movie among the most expensive films ever made, and the studio still had to spend millions more marketing it. Much Carolco executives hoped the scale of the spectacle would guarantee massive box office success. But another problem was quietly forming. Public interest in pirate movies was nearly non-existent. For decades, pirate adventures had almost disappeared from theaters. Younger audiences had grown up watching science fiction, superhero stories, and modern action films instead. Swashbuckling sword fights and treasure maps felt like relics from an earlier era of cinema. Studios had abandoned the genre for a reason, but Carolco believed they could change that. Marketing campaigns promised explosive action, epic battles, and a bold new pirate hero. Trailers showcased massive ships crashing through harbor walls and sword fights erupting across burning decks. Yet audiences remained uncertain. When the film's advertising struggled to communicate why viewers should care about this particular pirate adventure, the story felt unfamiliar. The characters were unknown, and the film's enormous budget created dangerous expectations. For Carolco, the release of Cutthroat Island was no longer just another movie premiere. It was a test of survival. When Cutthroat Island finally opened in theaters during the winter of 1995, the atmosphere inside the studio was tense. Executives waited anxiously for the first box office reports. The initial numbers were disappointing. The film failed to attract large crowds during its opening weekend. Reviews from critics were mixed. Some praised the ambitious action scenes and Gina Davis's performance. But others criticized the story and questioned whether audiences still cared about pirate adventures at all. More worrying was the reaction from general moviegoers. Interest remained extremely low. Ticket sales declined quickly after the opening weekend. The film simply wasn't connecting with audiences. For Carolco Pictures, the numbers were becoming terrifying, because the studio didn't just need the film to succeed, they needed it to become a massive global blockbuster, and that was clearly not happening. Week after week, the situation grew worse. Instead of gaining momentum through word of mouth, the film lost theaters as distributors replaced it with more successful releases. The global box office slowly climbed toward $10 million. Then it stopped. $10 million, against a production budget of nearly $100 million. Once marketing costs were included, the financial loss became staggering. Industry analysts began describing Cutthroat Island as one of the biggest box office disasters in Hollywood history. For Carolco Pictures, the damage was far more than embarrassing. It was fatal. The studio had invested everything into the project. Now that investment had vanished, and the company still owed enormous sums to investors and lenders. The collapse of the film triggered a chain reaction, one that would soon erase the studio entirely. The box office disaster of Cutthroat Island did not simply embarrass Carolco Pictures. It exposed how fragile the entire company had already become. For years, Carolco had operated like a high-stakes gambler. Every film required complicated financial arrangements involving loans, pre-sold distribution rights, and international investors. The strategy allowed the studio to produce massive action spectacles without the backing of a giant corporate parent. But it also meant the company carried enormous debt. When a film succeeded, the system worked beautifully. When a film failed, the entire structure could collapse. And now Carolco had just suffered one of the worst financial disasters Hollywood had ever seen. The problem was simple. The studio had built its future around a movie that barely anyone went to see. By early 1996, the damage from Cutthroat Island was spreading rapidly through Carolco's finances. Creditors began demanding repayment. Investors questioned whether the studio could survive long enough to produce another film. Banks that had once eagerly financed Carolco projects suddenly refused to provide additional funding. The company still had multiple obligations to pay: production loans, distribution agreements, and commitments to investors around the world. But the money from their biggest project had disappeared. Without box office revenue, Carolco simply had no way to cover its debts. Inside the company offices, the mood shifted from concern to panic. Executives began exploring desperate solutions. Could the studio sell future film rights? Could they bring in new investors? Could another company purchase the studio entirely? Every option required something Carolco no longer possessed: confidence. In Hollywood, reputation matters almost as much as money. A studio known for success attracts talent, investors, and distribution partners. A studio associated with financial disaster becomes something very different: a risk. After Cutthroat Island, that risk became impossible to ignore. Major actors and directors quietly avoided projects connected to Carolco. Agents warned clients about the studio's unstable finances. Investors became cautious. Distribution partners hesitated to sign new deals. The industry had watched what happened when a studio placed all its hopes on one massive gamble. Now they were watching the consequences. For Carolco, this isolation was devastating. Even if the studio wanted to begin another project to recover financially, they no longer had the credibility to attract the talent and financing required to make it happen. The studio was running out of time. As the financial situation deteriorated, legal battles quickly followed. When a major film collapses financially, the consequences rarely stop at the box office. Contracts become disputed. Investors seek compensation. Partners accuse each other of mismanagement. Cutthroat Island triggered all of it. Several investors claimed they had been misled about the financial risks involved in the production. Others argued the film's escalating budget had been handled irresponsibly. Disagreements erupted over distribution agreements and financing deals that had been negotiated before the film's release. The lawsuits piled up rapidly. For a studio already drowning in debt, legal battles only accelerated the collapse. Money that might have been used to stabilize the company was now being consumed by court disputes. Carolco had hoped Cutthroat Island would launch a new era of success. Instead, the film had opened a floodgate of financial chaos. By the spring of 1996, the situation was impossible to control. Carolco Pictures officially filed for bankruptcy protection. For a studio that had once produced some of the biggest action films of the previous decade, the announcement sent shockwaves through Hollywood. This was not a small production company quietly shutting down. As the years passed, Cutthroat Island developed a strange reputation in Hollywood history. It became known as one of the greatest financial disasters ever created by a single movie. Film schools studied it. Industry analysts referenced it. Executives used it as a warning when discussing risky productions. But something else happened over time. Some viewers began revisiting the movie. And surprisingly, many of them discovered something unexpected. The film itself wasn't terrible. The action scenes were energetic. The practical effects were impressive. Gina Davis delivered a committed performance as the daring pirate captain Morgan Adams. The movie even contained spectacular naval battles rarely attempted in modern filmmaking. In many ways, the film looked like a traditional swashbuckling adventure from an earlier era of cinema. But that may have been the problem. The movie arrived at the wrong moment in Hollywood history. Audiences simply wanted something different. For years after Cutthroat Island, pirate movies became a symbol of financial danger inside the film industry. Whenever producers pitched pirate adventures to studios, executives remembered the Carolco disaster.